The plane jolted violently, rattling overhead compartments and sending a sharp gasp through the cabin. A few unsecured drinks toppled from tray tables, splashing onto stunned passengers. The sudden drop wasn't just turbulence, it was something worse. Karen Blake tightened her grip on the armrest. She had felt turbulence before, plenty of times. But this wasn't normal. She could tell by the way the engines hesitated, how the plane's nose slightly tilted downward before correcting itself. A subtle movement, almost imperceptible to most, but not to her. Experience had trained her instincts to recognize the warning signs before others even registered danger. Across the aisle, a businessman in a tailored suit clenched his eyes shut, mumbling something under his breath. A flight attendant hurried past, her smile forced, her steps a little too quick. She knew something too. Karen glanced out the window. Thick clouds churned below, dark and restless. Storm systems weren't unusual, but this one had an unpredictable edge. The plane wasn't just caught in turbulence, it was struggling. Another lurch, stronger this time. Gasps turned to stifled cries. A woman a few rows ahead clutched her partner's arm, her knuckles white. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence, but rest assured, we have it under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The voice was calm, steady, but Karen heard the hesitation beneath it. Pilots were trained to stay composed, to keep passengers reassured even when things got tense. But there was something in his tone, a fraction of a second, where confidence wavered. Her gut twisted. Karen had spent 20 years in the cockpit of military jets. She had flown through storms that sent less experienced pilots into a panic. She knew what a pilot sounded like when they were genuinely in control. And this man? He was trying to convince himself as much as the passengers. She shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping against her knee, watching, listening, waiting. Then, the cockpit door opened. A tall man with a commanding presence stepped into the first-class cabin, adjusting the cuffs of his uniform. Captain John Marshall. The name was embroidered neatly on his badge. He had the air of someone who had spent decades flying, someone used to being in charge. But there was something else, something beneath the confident posture, a hint of unease. He scanned the cabin, his eyes landing on Karen. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but then it was gone. He approached her row with measured steps, offering a polite but tight-lipped smile. "Miss Blake, I couldn't help but notice earlier, you seem a little unfamiliar with some of our first-class amenities. May I offer some guidance?" Karen blinked. She had expected a lot of things, a direct acknowledgement of the turbulence, an update on their flight path, maybe even a quiet reassurance. But this, a lesson on first-class etiquette? For a moment, she just stared at him. His voice was calm, controlled, but she recognized the underlying message. It wasn't about the amenities, it was about her. She had seen that look before, on men who underestimated her, who questioned her place, who mistook quiet observation for ignorance. She forced a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I think I'll manage, Captain, but thanks for the concern." His expression flickered, just for a second. A moment of hesitation. Then he nodded, straightened his uniform, and turned back toward the cockpit. Karen exhaled slowly. Something was wrong, and Captain Marshall had just told her, without saying a single word, that he knew it too. Karen watched as Captain Marshall disappeared back into the cockpit, his shoulders squared, his stride purposeful. A performance. She had seen it before in too many men who needed to project confidence, even when they were teetering on the edge of control. The plane jolted again, more aggressively this time. A baby wailed somewhere in the cabin, and the nervous murmurs of passengers grew louder. The flight attendants moved quickly, their smiles stretched too thin. Karen glanced at the nearest one, young, mid-20s, trying her best to keep it together. She adjusted her uniform and hurried toward the galley. Something was happening up front. Karen turned her gaze to the window again. The clouds had thickened, darker now, swirling in an ominous formation. The sun had disappeared behind them, casting an eerie gray shadow over the world outside. Then she heard it, a sound beneath the usual hum of the engines, a brief stutter, a fluctuation so slight that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Karen wasn't most people. She knew how an engine should sound, and she knew when it was struggling. Her instincts flared. Something was off with the left engine. She inhaled slowly, measuring her options. She wasn't the pilot. She wasn't crew, just a passenger. Stepping in without invitation would cause a scene. But if she was right, if the engine was failing, then waiting for an official response wasn't an option. She turned her head, catching the eye of the flight attendant she had seen earlier. The young woman hesitated, sensing Karen's urgency. Karen leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "What's going on up there?" The attendant swallowed. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I need you to remain seated." Not a real answer. Another jolt rocked the plane, harder this time. Several gasps rang out. Karen could feel the shift in the aircraft's balance. Slight, but definite. They weren't just caught in turbulence anymore. They were losing control. Her decision was made. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Immediately, the flight attendant stepped closer, her expression tight. "Ma'am, I need you to sit down." Karen kept her voice steady. "I need to talk to your captain. Now." The attendant hesitated, clearly caught between protocol and the urgency in Karen's tone. Before she could answer, the overhead intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are encountering heavier turbulence than expected. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, prepare for—" The message cut off. Abrupt, unnatural. That was all the confirmation Karen needed. Ignoring the attendant's protests, she moved down the aisle toward the cockpit. Eyes followed her. Whispers, uncertainty. Some passengers were too panicked to care. Others watched with cautious curiosity. She reached the reinforced door and knocked. Firm, no answer. Another knock, louder, still nothing. Karen exhaled sharply. She knew she had no official authority here, but she also knew pilots. If things were fine, someone would have responded. Things were not fine. She turned to the attendant. "You can either let me in or I can stand here knocking until the captain has no choice." The young woman wavered. Fear flickered across her face, but so did something else. Trust. She must have heard the engine, too. Must have sensed that something wasn't right. Without another word, she reached for the intercom on the wall, pressing a button. The cockpit door clicked open. The door to the cockpit cracked open just enough for Karen to slip inside before it clicked shut behind her. The air inside was thick with tension, a sharp contrast to the controlled chaos of the cabin. Captain Marshall was hunched over the controls, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle twitched. His co-pilot, a younger man in his 30s, looked pale, his hands hovering uncertainly over the throttle. Sweat glistened on his forehead. The cockpit lights flickered. A warning alarm beeped softly in the background. Karen didn't need to ask what was wrong. She saw it instantly. The left engine was failing. The indicators were blinking erratically, pressure readings fluctuating. The autopilot was struggling to compensate, making slight but noticeable corrections that weren't enough to stabilize the aircraft. She took a single step forward. "You're losing thrust." Marshall whipped his head around. His eyes darkened when he saw her. "What the hell are you doing in here? Trying to stop your plane from falling out of the sky." His nostrils flared. "This is my cockpit. You're a passenger. Sit down and let us do our job." Karen folded her arms. "Your job? The job where you ignored the warning signs? Where you pretended this was just turbulence when you knew damn well something was wrong?" The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flicked between them. Karen saw hesitation in his face, the kind that told her he wasn't completely on board with Marshall's approach. The plane jolted again, harder than before. The instrument panel flickered, and a fresh set of alerts appeared. The left engine was nearing a full stall. Karen pointed to the screen. "You've got maybe 3 minutes before that engine fully fails. Less if you keep pretending you can ride it out." Marshall's fingers tightened on the control column. "I've been flying for 25 years. I don't need some ex-military—" "Then act like it," Karen snapped. "Because right now, you're frozen. And every second you waste trying to prove something is a second closer to us making an unscheduled landing in the middle of nowhere." The words hung between them, heavy. The co-pilot swallowed hard. Karen leaned forward, her voice quieter but sharper. "I don't care about your pride, Captain. I care about that engine, and right now, it needs you to let go of whatever's holding you back and focus." Marshall's breath was unsteady. He glared at her, but something shifted in his expression. Not anger, realization. Karen turned to the co-pilot. "We need to balance thrust manually. Cut power to the failing engine before it stalls completely. Reduce differential pressure before it pulls us into a spin." Marshall hesitated. The plane dipped. The cockpit shuddered. And then, finally, he spoke. "Do it." The moment Marshall gave the order, Karen moved fast. She wasn't here to challenge his authority. She was here to keep this plane in the air. The co-pilot, a man whose name tag read Ryan Hale, glanced at her, waiting for instruction. That was a good sign. It meant he knew the situation was beyond routine protocol. Throttle back the left engine manually, Karen said, her voice steady. Don't kill it completely, just ease it down so it doesn't stall on its own. Hale's hands flew to the controls. The engine's groan softened, but the plane still vibrated as if unsure whether to obey. The altitude reading continued to drop, too fast. Marshall adjusted the yoke, fighting the descent. We're still losing speed, he muttered. Karen scanned the panel. The storm outside was making things worse, throwing unexpected wind shifts at them. She calculated quickly. The right engine was overcompensating, pulling them off balance. Recalibrate thrust distribution, she said. Keep the right engine steady at 60%, left at 35. Marshall gritted his teeth but followed her lead. The plane leveled slightly, not perfect, but better. An alert blinked red. Another problem. The hydraulics, Hale said, a tremor in his voice. Karen's stomach tightened. The turbulence wasn't just weather. It was affecting the plane's stability system. If the hydraulics went, they'd lose most control of the flaps, the rudder, even the landing gear. Marshall's jaw flexed. He knew it too. Karen exhaled slowly. We need to reroute. There's no way we're making it to JFK like this. Marshall hesitated. Hale looked between them. There's an alternate airstrip 200 miles west, he said. Not ideal, but long enough to land. Karen met Marshall's eyes. You know what needs to be done. For a second, he didn't move. Then finally, he reached for the radio. This is Captain Marshall. We're declaring an emergency. The radio crackled as Marshall spoke, his voice clipped but controlled. Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 279, declaring an emergency. Left engine compromised, hydraulic instability, requesting immediate diversion. Static filled the cockpit for a second before a response came through. Flight 279, roger that. Stand by for reroute instructions. Karen kept her eyes on the altitude meter. They were still descending, though more gradually now. Not good enough. We need more lift, she said. Adjust the flaps manually. Hydraulics are unreliable, but we still have some control. Hale nodded, flipping the necessary switches. The plane shuddered but responded. Marshall exhaled through his nose, his grip firm on the yoke. Flight 279, diverting you to Hudson Regional, the radio responded. Runway is short, but it's your best option. Karen's mind raced. Hudson Regional was a small airfield, not designed for a jet this size. She glanced at Marshall, but before she could speak, he answered. We'll make it work. It was the right call. They didn't have a choice. Another jolt rocked the aircraft. A sharp beeping sound filled the cockpit, another warning light. Karen's stomach clenched. What now? Hale's voice was tense. Landing gear response is unstable. Of course it was. Karen rubbed her temple. If we can't get it down in time, we'll need to belly land. Marshall stiffened, but he didn't argue. That was progress. Passengers need to brace, Hale said, his voice taut. Marshall nodded. I'll make the announcement. He pressed the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're making an emergency landing. Please follow crew instructions and assume brace positions. Karen barely heard the gasps from the cabin. Her focus was locked on the fast-approaching airstrip ahead. No room for error, no second chances. They were bringing this plane down. The cabin fell into tense silence, broken only by the low hum of the struggling engines and the occasional beep of warning indicators. Karen didn't need to see the passengers to know the fear gripping them. She could feel it pressing against the thin walls of the cockpit, heavy and suffocating. Marshall's knuckles were white against the yoke as he guided the plane through the storm. The wipers struggled against the sheets of rain hammering the windshield, each drop distorting their already limited view. Flaps at 10 degrees, Karen instructed, her voice firm. We need to bleed off more speed before we hit final approach. Hale adjusted the controls. The plane shuddered but obeyed. The altitude indicator ticked lower, too fast for comfort. 5,000 feet, Hale called out. Karen's gaze flicked to the approaching runway, short, narrow, the kind of airstrip that wouldn't tolerate mistakes. Marshall exhaled sharply. We're coming in heavy. If the landing gear fails, we deal with it, Karen cut in. There was no point in dwelling on what they couldn't control. For now, focus on getting us lined up. The aircraft rocked again as a gust of wind caught the fuselage. Marshall fought against it, adjusting the rudder to compensate. The engines groaned under the strain. 3,000 feet, Hale reported, speed still high. Karen gritted her teeth. The right engine was still overcompensating. If they didn't balance the thrust, they'd come in too hot. Marshall, reduce right engine to 40%. His jaw tightened, but he complied. The plane dipped slightly, then steadied. 2,000 feet. The rain blurred the runway lights, turning them into streaks of gold and white. Karen reached for the control panel, deploying landing gear. Hale watched the indicators. The seconds stretched. Then, main gear locked, he confirmed, but his face remained tense. The nose wheel? Karen pressed. Hale shook his head. Still unresponsive. Karen clenched her fists. Without the nose gear, the plane's front end would slam into the tarmac on touchdown. Risky. 500 feet, Hale called, voice tight. Marshall's grip tightened. We're out of time. Karen took a slow breath. No second chances. No room for doubt. They were landing. Now. The wheels hit the runway hard, jolting every bone in Karen's body. The plane groaned under the impact, the tires screeching as they fought for traction on the rain-slicked tarmac. The cabin erupted in screams and gasps, overhead compartments rattling violently. Marshall gritted his teeth, gripping the yoke with both hands. Reverse thrust, now! Hale's fingers flew over the controls, engaging the reverse engines. A deep roar filled the cockpit as the plane fought to slow down. Karen's eyes locked onto the speed indicator. Too fast. The runway was too short for this kind of landing, and they were still carrying too much momentum. The end of the strip rushed toward them, the runway lights blurring in the heavy rain. Karen's mind raced. The nose gear hadn't deployed. The second they lost forward momentum, the front of the plane would slam into the tarmac, grinding metal against pavement. Brace! She barked. Marshall pulled back gently, trying to keep the nose up as long as possible, buying them precious seconds. The plane shuddered violently, the right engine straining. The hydraulics warning light blinked red, seconds away from total failure. The end of the runway loomed closer, a chain-link fence. Beyond it, wet grass and the faint outline of an emergency crew, flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Full brakes! Karen shouted. Marshall stomped the pedal, his foot pressing down with everything he had. The force slammed Karen forward against her restraints. The smell of burning rubber filled the cockpit. Then, impact. The nose of the plane dropped. The front wheel, still locked, refused to extend. A metallic screech tore through the air as the fuselage scraped against the pavement. Sparks erupted from beneath them, lighting up the stormy night. The aircraft skidded, veering slightly to the left. For a moment, Karen thought they'd lose control entirely, that the plane would tip, that they'd roll. Then, just as suddenly as it started, they stopped. The world outside blurred in the rain. Inside the cockpit, only the sound of heavy breathing filled the space. They had made it, barely. The silence was deafening. For a moment, nobody moved. The cockpit was filled only with the sound of unsteady breathing and the faint hum of dying engines. Rain pelted against the windshield, streaking through the glow of emergency lights outside. Karen's fingers loosened their grip on the edge of the console. Her muscles ached from the tension. She turned her head slightly, meeting Marshall's wide-eyed stare. His hands were still locked on the yoke, his knuckles ghostly white. Then came the first sound from the cabin, a single, tentative cheer, and then another, and then an eruption. Applause, relieved laughter, the raw sound of people who had come face to face with something terrifying and survived. Karen exhaled slowly. It was over. Marshall leaned back in his seat, running a shaking hand through his hair. Hale let out something between a nervous chuckle and a gasp, wiping sweat from his brow. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Marshall turned to her. You, he swallowed, his voice hoarse. You saved us. Karen tilted her head. We saved us. His lips pressed together. The weight of everything that had happened was settling over him like a storm finally breaking. She could see it in his posture, the way his shoulders dropped, the rigid pride finally cracking under the realization of how close they had come to disaster. A voice crackled through the radio. Flight 279, emergency crews are approaching. Stay in place for assessment. Karen unbuckled her harness, rolling her stiff shoulders. She moved first, pushing open the cockpit door. The moment she stepped into the cabin, the passengers erupted again. Some stood, others clapped from their seats, and more than a few had tears in their eyes. She didn't bask in it, didn't acknowledge it more than a small, weary nod. Instead, she scanned the faces, noting the way fear had shifted into something else, relief, gratitude, recognition. Marshall and Hale emerged behind her. The energy in the room changed again, people whispering, pointing. One passenger, a woman in her 50s, still clutching her husband's hand, spoke first. You, her voice wavered, you went up there. You flew the plane. Karen shook her head. I helped. That's all. A younger man near the front leaned forward. That was more than help. Another voice chimed in. You're the reason we're still here. Karen had spent years in the military, stepping in where she was needed, doing her job without expecting thanks. This moment felt different. Marshall cleared his throat behind her. She turned, expecting more resistance, some kind of defense, but instead he nodded, a small gesture, but loaded with meaning. Then, in a voice just loud enough for only her to hear, he said, I misjudged you. Karen studied him, then gave a small, knowing smile. You did. He let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a quiet laugh. Outside, the emergency lights flashed, the rain easing into a soft drizzle. The worst had passed. Karen adjusted her jacket, taking one last look at the plane, at the passengers, at the exhausted but relieved faces around her. Then, with the confidence of someone who had been through storms far worse than this, she walked off the aircraft without looking back.